Our speaker today is Jordyn Gunville. She is a graduate student in health policy and management at the University of Kansas Medical Center. She used to work here. Some of you may recognize her. She was an undergrad here, worked here for a while, then moved on, got her bachelor's, her master's, and now is working on her doctorate. She does a whole bunch of issues in maternal child health up at the Center for American Indian Community Health, where she works in conjunction with doing her doctorate. She's from Cheyenne River Reservation up in South Dakota, and so a lot of what she's going to talk about today is going to be focused on Northern Plains and her community. So I'll just let Jordyn talk.
Hi everybody, good afternoon. Like you mentioned, I'm Jordyn Gunville, and I am Minikoju Lakota, and I am from the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and I am from a little community called Whitehorse, South Dakota, and that's about 45 minutes from our tribal headquarters, where I did graduate from high school, and I did grow up on the reservation all my life, and so like he mentioned, a lot of my research is kind of, it's influenced by my firsthand experience in growing up on the reservation, and things that I've experienced within my family that's really motivated me to go on and kind of address these disparities and close this gap in maternal child health. So one of my big interests is in maternal child health. I started kind of looking at, let's say like 5 to adolescent age, because my mom is an educator, and so she's a single parent, and I just kind of always tagged along with her and kind of, I guess I've been serving since I was a little girl. And so I was able to kind of see how these events in these kiddos' life really predicted their health outcomes and their access to obtaining higher education. And so when I got my public health background, then that's when I really started like, well, I want to prevent this, so where can I start? And that's kind of how I got into a lot of the infant and maternal work I do, looking at when the infant's in utero. So, as he mentioned today, I'm going to be talking about the American Indian maternal and child health impacts of reservation life, I guess. So I want to go ahead and start today's talk by defining what is Indian country. We often hear this in our literature, in our talks, and we refer to this, our communities refer to where we live and where we play as Indian country. So usually American Indian will categorize themselves as living in a certain area, and often these areas are reservation, rural reservation, urban, and tribal trust land. And so it's funny because in Kansas you have reservations who have access to, for example, we work at Periband Potawatomi. In 30 minutes, 25 minutes, there's Topeka. Well, where I come from, I consider that rural reservation because in order for me to get to any other specialty medical service, I have to drive 3 hours. There are 573 federally recognized tribes, and depending on what your tribe, your nation, your culture, however, everybody kind of has their own preference of what they're called. I like to be called tribe, so the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and then I also always refer to my band. So I am of the Minikoju band. There are state recognized tribes, and I gave an example, the Lumbee. So they are recognized at that state level, but not at a federal level. And excuse me if some of this is redundant. I just wanted to make sure that when I'm referring through my presentations, we kind of had an idea of the measurement of distance and isolation that I'll be referring to. And here's just a map of all the different federally recognized tribes. And I am from right here. Okay, so I really wanted to touch on federal government responsibilities. As Dr. Daly mentioned, I am a health policy and management doctoral student. So I really am fascinated with kind of these health systems, if you will, and how these responsibilities of the tribe really factor into the well-being of the population. So typically a tribe, and like Dr. Daly said, I am speaking from my tribe's perspective. So so they have a broad range of responsibilities, from determining their laws and policies to government affairs, so developing resolutions, just kind of addressing whatever need there is at that federal level. They also have a burden of having to not only manage their own sovereign nations, but kind of finding a way to work with policy makers on the national and the county as well as the state levels. So I wanted to recognize that because it is not an easy task for our tribal council leaders. Education, we have our own education. A lot of our schools are funded through Title I, so very low income. We get that federal funding through Title I. We have our own law enforcement, so we have our own tribal jurisdiction, and we have our own judicial system that is all handled on reservation. Unless it's something that's really, really bad, then that's when the U.S. Marshal or the feds will then intervene, but they do it with support of the tribe. But they cannot come onto our reservations and handle matters. They're handled within our own system. So our healthcare system, so we have two. We have Indian Health Service and we have tribal health centers, and I'll go into more detail about that. Environmental prevention, natural resource management, and developing and maintenance of basic infrastructure such as housing, roads, bridges, sewers, buildings. We have a lot of asbestos, and I won't get into the history of it, but there was a flooding, and so the BIA took some of our buildings and then they transported it to where our reservation sits now. And so a lot of these kids are being raised in homes with asbestos and lead paint, and so because we're so funded, that those aren't being addressed. So, and you'll see the outcome from that in some of my slides soon. And then the electric service, any type of internet, we have very poor internet, hardly any internet. Solid waste and disposal, so like landfills. Dr. Daly's wife had a doctoral student who was getting his doctorate in architecture, but he wanted to really understand the public health behind architecture. So he works a lot in Wyandotte. He does a lot of great work in Wyandotte County. Well, he wanted to come to the reservation because he just, when he's learning about building infrastructures, that's one thing he couldn't get over was our landfill, right? So he came up one summer with us, and we were touring it, and he was like, these kids are playing and it's not properly laid, but that's another thing to kind of keep in mind, how these treaty agreements that aren't being met, how it really does affect these institutions and these infrastructures that then play out in these kids' overall health and the roles of our community. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm from the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, and just to give you a little bit of background about what my home looks like, there's approximately 16,000 enrolled members. My reservation is equivalent to the size of Connecticut. It's in two counties, Ziebach and Dewey. Ziebach is one of the poorest counties in the United States. I think the top 5 maybe. And if you look at the poorest counties, majority of them are reservations from South Dakota. There's an 88% unemployment rate, and the per capita income is less than $7,500. So that means that a household will make $7,500 in 1 year. So here is our tribal headquarters, and then I live about right here, my little community. So for example, these kids will be bussed in from all over, almost a 2-hour bus ride one way to get to school and 2 hours back. So very, very isolated, a lot of driving. So what is reservation life like? I usually don't get into this detail just because, that's home. That's where my mom and my dad, everybody, I'm the only person here off the reservation. So I tend to get kind of touchy with this, but I think it's a good representation when we talk about some of the gender roles I'm going to be hitting on today. And since you're all faculty members, I thought this would be appropriate space. So you see here we have harsh weather conditions. I mean, being in South Dakota, we have uncontrollable weather seasons, so very long winters. Inadequate housing. And here's an example. You can see I have two housing. These kids, a family was actually living in this home. And they were on a waiting list for FEMA trailers. And then you can see a lot of these windows in these trailer homes. They have 2x4s just because it gets so cold. Low high school graduation rates, food insecurity, poor health status, high rates of violence, so that is gang violence and domestic violence. Alcohol and substance use. We are currently in a methamphetamine crisis that is just really hurting our community right now. There's a lack of service for people living with disabilities. And this is very important because 50% of our population is 18 and under. And the data says that 50% of American Indian population has some type of disability. So that kind of illustrates that this lack of service for this special population. There's a lack of access to healthcare. So Indian Health Service, because our health system is a little bit different. And I'll go into more detail about that in another slide. And but even though we have stark health disparities and we have a lot of obstacles, we do have strong ties to our culture. And that's what I'm gonna hit on next. That's kind of these identity roles in our culture is really what is making our people resilient and helping us get through and navigating these harsh times. So Lakota society. So we are a matriarchic society, but we are a war society, right? So a lot of our history is taught to us through battles. And so we kind of have seven values that we live by, and we're taught these as little kids, that you must live this way of life. And those are praying, respect, caring and compassion, honesty and truth, generosity and caring, humility and wisdom. A woman has 4 cardinal virtues, and that's bravery, truthfulness, childbearing, and that's where I come in, my research, and generosity. And for the man, they also have bravery, fortitude, wisdom, and generosity. So, as an Indian woman, a Lakota woman, we're often raised that the way that you have value in your life is through the amount of children you have, right? So I found this, I always refer back to this quote that I have read once, and it explains how when the white buffalo calf pipe woman, and so we are the keepers of the white buffalo calf pipe bundle, and so that sits on our reservation. And so when she came and she gave us the sacred pipe bundle, she gave us the seven Lakota values, and then she gave us our 7 rights, like becoming of a man, throwing of a ball, all these things that kind of mild marked us as people, like becoming of a woman. When you have that space to then become a mother, then you've made that transition into motherhood. So I'm just going to read this quote. So after she had given the Lakota people their values, she then said that the work of their, she told the Lakota women that the work of their hands and that the fruit of their womb would be kept is what would keep the tribe alive. So, and I mentioned it before that Lakota people really have this emphasis on children, and we're always taught. I don't know, my colleague was here a few months ago, and he's Navajo. And it's always important to remember that we all kind of have our own ways of prayer or our own ways of kind of doing stuff. But one thing is the same across all majority of tribes is that children are very sacred to us. And if you ever need a moment to pray, they always say, go get a kid. They're sacred, they're pure. And so I come from Lakota, we do Sundance. And so when we Sundance and we do Humblecha, which is a vision quest, and then after you do that, you do the Sundance. It's a child, a virgin, who has not had her menstrual cycle that brings in that sacred tree that we pray to. So kids are very held at this really high esteem. So for me, as a researcher, I'm very curious to why we're having such these really high mortality rates for these kids, and that's where I want to address it. So mothers are seen kind of as the caretakers and the social source of cultural knowledge. So it's their duty to kind of pass it on, and influence that's often used through my teaching and being a mother to my children is you influence. That's your role as a Lakota woman, is you influence your children, and that's how your culture is going to be passed on. A woman's identity is generally rooted through her spirituality and her extended family and her tribe. So she has this obligation to take care of her tioshbe, which translates to extended family. So the role of the men, men were hunters and warriors and responsible for feeding and defending their families. And they're the only, in our tribe, are the only individuals that can become chiefs. So historically, they would be on the war, either on a war or hunting or kind of looking out. And so the women would sit there, and that's where that caretaker really comes in, where they would really watch the camps. And sometimes when they hunt in these weather conditions, then the women would be left at camp. And so they would really have to really hold it down, right? And so they say that they can put up a teepee. So their role is to take care of the teepee. So the women would carry the teepees and the hide for the teepee, and they would put these up in 15 minutes. So kind of like fun fact, I went to a tribal school. And in order for us to graduate, we took Lakota language from Head Start all the way to 12th grade. But that was one of our tests to make that requirement to graduate high school. Was we had this cultural class where we had to go and set up a teepee, right? So the women would be sitting it up, and then the men would kind of sit there and watch, and then they would have to go out. We have a buffalo ranch, and so then they would go and they would learn how to kill a buffalo, gut a buffalo, and then kind of we use every part of the buffalo, and so that's how they were like taught. So they really do try to teach us, how to hold on to our culture, if you will, in this contemporary way that we're trying to live as well. Okay, so childbearing and motherhood. So often you become a woman once you get your menstrual cycle. And so each tribe will have their own type of puberty ceremony. And so for us, once you get your menstrual cycle, that's the time when you then are able to become a mother. And then when you're a mother, you have these responsibilities to be a caretaker. And it's kind of implied that you have children in order to fulfill that duty as a woman. And so I was taught that when you have your menstrual, and I hate to compare it to Catholic religion, but I'm also Catholic, so it was explained to me this way, that when I go to confession, that I'm confessing my sins. Well, traditionally, when I have my menstrual, I am purifying myself. My blood, I'm purifying any type of sin I may have done prior. So that way, if I were to get pregnant in that cycle, that infant would then be born in purity because he's sacred. And then the mother's bond starts in the womb, right? So at that point that you are purified, that's when you really start your body, you start preparing for the infant to come. And we acknowledge the baby at that time of your menstrual. And so when a woman's on her menstrual cycle, she usually doesn't cook for her family. Often you are not allowed to go, we're not allowed to be around pipes, go to Sundance, sweat lodges, any type of ceremony purpose, because a woman, that's when she's the most powerful. And as a kid, during that time, my mom used to come in and pray with me because she taught me that your prayer as a woman, you are the backbone of our families. So what you pray for and how you pray will really affect us. So as kids, we're taught that prayer is powerful, and that's one of our rights, but we're taught in this time, during our time of our moon, that we can't pray a certain way because it's powerful. During that time, you're so pure because that's when you're the most you're the most connected to Unchimuka, which is the earth, like grandmother earth. So, and I don't mean to get so cultural on you. And then we prepare for taking care of the children. So the mom, typically what we do is when you, Lakota people do when we have an infant is when an individual's pregnant, you are not allowed to buy or prepare for your infant. Usually the extended family will do that. And the reason behind it is our translations are kind of hard, so kind of the way that I can translate it to English would be don't count your eggs, or don't put all your eggs in a basket. And my little brother passed away, and she was really excited to have him. And so she was later in life, she was told she wouldn't be able to have kids no more, and she was really hard on herself because as a Lakota woman, you're defined by the amount of kids you have, right? So she just had me, and she struggled with it, and so she got pregnant with my little brother, and she lost him. He passed away as an infant, and she just really, was hard on herself because she had bought a blanket, and then she received a star quilt. One of her girlfriends got her a star quilt, and she took it, she brought it home, and she washed it, and she said, I wasn't being humble. I wasn't fulfilling my role as a woman because I was expecting this. I wasn't, appreciating it in the moment. So that's kind of how I explain that. And then, as I mentioned, the extended family prepares for the newborn. Grandmothers play a huge role in our tribe. Often you'll hear grandmothers raising their grandchildren, and that's kind of and I always ask my grandma, why is this? And she explained to me that back when the mothers would be giving birth, that they didn't have a lot of, we didn't have medicine, like Western medicine. So often the women would hemorrhage, and they would be so weak that the grandmas then would take care of the babies. And then once the mom kind of got her strength, she had to then take care of her other children. So it just kind of became this cultural norm in child rearing. And then mothers are caregivers, as I mentioned. So often it was okay that these grandmas were taking the babies because she had to, when we say caregiver, she was caring for her tioshbe, her community, She had to get that teepee up. She had to, if they didn't come back for that hunt, she had to figure out, what they were going to eat. And so often it's funny because the way that we're taught traditionally, it really does play out on reservation life like this. And the way it's very transparent into this contemporary way that we live, that these roles of the grandparents, and that it's okay for these moms to tend to other needs while grandma takes care of the babies. And so one big thing too that I never really appreciated or could identify until I became a parent, and it was taught to me. And that's kind of the way that our culture is one time I was in sweat lodge, and I was like asked about sweetgrass, and my medicine man said to me, he said, "You don't ask stuff until you need it, and that's when you get taught it, because it's a humility. It's a way of a humility way of teaching, I guess." So this is when I really got to understand this disciplinary role. And so women are the disciplinaries of families. So often, and I get it, so when I would be getting in trouble when I was in high school, right? My grandma, they would leave the room, and my grandma walked in and I knew. You know? She just had to look at me and I knew I was in trouble. And that look, and you know, we held children and elders at a high esteem in our communities. And so that's a big thing. If you get a head shake from an elder, they don't gotta say nothing, and you just feel this shame. It's horrible. Like, I could fail out of college, I could lose all my money, but let me tell you, that's a horrible feeling for an Indian woman. And I laugh because my colleague was here a few months ago, and if anybody was here, he kind of like said the same thing about when his grandparents, the disappointment from your grandparents. It's a big thing, and they do play an important role in our children's life in our community. So as I kind of mentioned, I talk a lot about this, kind of this relationship with our moms and our grandmas. And so, and men are very important, and I know I'm not touching, but they do, they play a huge role. Often when we're taught our roles, our ways, we're split. You know, so then the men folk will take the little boys and teach them, and then the women will take the girls, and we're taught that way. Even in today, when we have any type of honorings, the men and women, we split. You know, when we eat, we split. And it's a respect thing. So I keep saying Tioshbe, which translates to extended family. And so our extended family is, you know, like my cousin, it would be no different to my biological sister. And that's how we see it. If you're in our extended family, we don't have this hierarchy like we do off reservation of like first cousin, second cousin, third cousin. We're family, family's family. So the aunts play a huge role in teaching. So typically, historically, they would teach the young girls how to like tend the hides and kind of do all that stuff. And so a big thing in contemporary reservation life is basketball, right? So these aunties then, that's kind of a way that they intervene and kind of still keep that kinship, that bond, is through different extracurricular activities or different things like that. And then relatives are very important. We're a very tight-knit people, tribe. And this here is actually at my family ranch and behind our house. And my parents, they have a culture camp. And so they bring the kids and they teach them their way, like the traditional ways. My father would get really mad knowing, because he's such a humble man, he don't like to be talked about, but he's a very traditional man, has very deep roots to our culture. So I'm really grateful that he's able to share these on with our community. So kind of now to my academic training where I get to make sense of all this fun stuff. So I have a background in my undergrad trainings in behavioral science. I went into behavioral science because I was very fascinated with the amount of disparity in my community, and we know what's wrong or we know what's bad for us, right? But why is it that these risky behaviors or these behaviors are still happening? I was really fascinated with this. And so that's kind of what influenced me to get that degree. And then I realized it's about prevention, right? And so how do we prevent chronic disease? How do we prevent unintentional injuries? How do we prevent this really bad stuff that's causing us to have high mortality and morbidity rates? So when I look at any type of my research, I often have this thing, what we call in public health is an upstream approach. And so in my epi training, we often find an issue and then we investigate that issue, right? And so that's kind of how I really got into maternal health, because I was able to see that these young kids we have high rates of disability, we have low high school education rate, we have very low college attainment, And so I was really fascinated about this. As I went through the higher education system, that's kind of where I really wanted to start working with like the younger group. And so, so that's just kind of, I just wanted to put this image up so you can, when I start talking. So I think that kind of starting with that upstream approach, what is it that's really, affecting these infants, these moms while they're pregnant and these kiddos? And so often when I am creating any type of, I'm a health service researcher, so I make a lot of regression models. So I'm trained through health economists, so that's what they do. They like to make models and see what the outcomes are and what's causing these, right? So often they tend to hate me though, because I'm like, what about the culture? Like, there's no air term for culture. And we're a marginalized population, there's 500 tribes, and that air term is gonna look different for every one of us. So how am I gonna, if I'm publishing this and making a policy, how is it that I'm gonna address all 500 tribes' needs at that national level? So they let me kind of really focus on these areas. And so these are the 4 main policies that I look at. So the first one is, when the federal government decided to put us on reservation, that really impacted us. And when I say impacted us, I often hear, growing up, I always heard my grandparents talking about, they put us on some of the harshest land, right? We can't farm. It's hard to ranch. The water source is horrible. We're always in drought, right? And so I really found that fascinating, and how that really plays out in terms of resources and how that affects our overall population health. The second policy is the boarding school era. And I'm really fascinated with this because I am not only because I study, I'm a behavioral analyst by undergrad training, but because my grandmother was in the boarding school system. And you can see and after really studying it and understanding how it displaced families and kind of what it did in this cycle, I often have to check myself as a parent, and I have these conversations with my mom, and she don't like them. I'll say, we use this term in some of our literature called intergenerational trauma, and it's passed along, they say. And so I often say, like, when I parent, for example, when I discipline my daughter, looks very different, because I was able to identify that my mom learned her parenting from my grandma, who was raised by nuns. And so I think that really, in some of my work, I look at how mother-infant bonding, how that improves birth outcomes, and how that improves the quality of life for a child. So and how it reduces postpartum depression. And so often I think that this event is very underlooked, but it impacts our communities highly. So I have a little video. Do I turn the sound up here?
Still not playing?
Huh.
Yeah. And in later years,
Okay.
the buses, they came to take the children away to boarding schools where they were to be taught the white man's way. An attempt to civilize, Christianize, and Europeanize the Indian. The boarding school movement created its own legacy. For the Indian people, it is a legacy of homesickness and isolation, coping and survival, and the breakup of the family. The boarding school experience has had a long-term profound impact on Native Americans spanning generations. For these former students, remembering these schools conjures up bittersweet memories. Almost as soon as the Europeans arrived on the east coast of the American continent, schooling for its native inhabitants was instituted with the idea of changing them and removing them from their own culture. Several of America's earliest colleges received some of their original funding on the grounds that they would house and educate youths from the surrounding tribes. Before the Europeans landed, the Indians surely had an intact, sophisticated culture, one that valued tradition, art, commerce, and education. The education of the children was vital for the survival of each tribe. It was the means to transfer their culture, stabilize the economic system, and maintain the
Okay, so they just kind of go on to explain the boarding school. And so I often refer to this because when I was raised, I heard a lot of stories from my grandma. So my grandma was one of 17. And so she explained to me that the way she would get to know her siblings was she would meet them in a courtyard, and she would sneak. She was 6 years. And she would tell me she was 6, putting on her stockings, and they would have like the old-fashioned up to their thighs, and she would sneak lotion into her stockings, and that's how she would bond with her brothers and really get to know her brothers. And it's funny because she would describe how she would put lotion on their hands, right? And she'd rub them. And anytime she passed away, but anytime she would see them at any of our events, my uncles would always come and put their hands out. She would always rub them. And it was like their sense of security. And so it's just fascinating to me how the reason why they were put into boarding schools was because they say kill the Indian was kind of the slogan, but they also deemed American Indian parents incompetent, and that because they were raising them traditionally and to live off the land, our traditional way, and that's how they determined that this was a competent way to raise children. So just because I have the background and the firsthand knowledge, I'm able to kind of reference that in my research. The next one is the Indian Relocation Act. So what they did is, in 1956, they tried to kind of do away with reservations. So they would pay for families and give them a little bit of money to relocate, and they had them relocate to major cities like LA, one in Ohio, Denver. So in these really, Chicago I think was one, I'm not sure. My grandparents' parents relocated to Compton, right? And I remember my grandma telling us stories about how they kind of would they lived with the Mexican people because that's who they looked most like, but they did not get along. And she said it was really horrible. They lasted like 2 weeks, and then they went home, and they trained my grandfather to be like a stone. He would make it's dropping my mind, headstones. And so she said that he was gone a long time, and my grandma didn't really speak good English, and so they really struggled. So they moved home, the family moved home, and then he later came. But ever since then, it really displaced our family. And what that does to somebody having 17 kids, I can only imagine the burden that puts on this family. And then in the 60s and 70s, there was this period where there was a sterilization of indigenous women. So IHS were sterilizing women essentially because they felt they were having too many children. And I've read a lot of literature that said why they justified giving women hysterectomies, for example, was because they didn't know how to properly take oral birth control. So, and right there, that's in the 60s, that's degrading. And so you can see how that can affect a woman's utilization of healthcare services, just in general for women health purposes. They can't trust the providers, and that's their only source of healthcare is through Indian Health Service. So I kind of wanted to give you, we talk a lot about history, and I find it fascinating that when I'm in school, college-wise, we talk a lot about like the historical events that occur and how it impacts our population, but we never talk about what's going on today. And I think in order for us to really make a difference, we have to kind of be aware of what's going on, what went on in the past. But how will we close those gaps is really understanding and measuring what's happening right now today. So this is kind of an older video. So as I mentioned earlier in the start of my presentation was how even though we are faced with these really harsh living conditions and these challenging realities, that through these cultural identities and these roles that are instilled in our upbringing, that we are able to be resilient. And that's often a word that we teach to our kids as they grow. And he kind of gave that example of like the paved road and the muddy road. And I think I think this video was out in 2015, but it's still a current representation of what our communities look like. Okay, so I'm going to start kind of looking at it from the kids' health status and then go all the way into pregnancy and infancy, and that's kind of where my expertise really lays. So often American Indian children are born with high rates of birth defects. For example, we have a kiddo who has spina bifida. So in order for him to receive treatment from Eagle Butte, our tribal headquarters, he has to go to Denver, Colorado, to receive that treatment. And his parents can't hold the job, and they don't make a lot. So you can see how these confounding factors really are affecting our kiddos, and just kind of they just have a little bit rougher start than their counterparts, non-native counterparts. ADHD is a really big one. Learning disabilities are really high. As I mentioned, there's a lot of buildings and homes that have asbestos and lead paint. Often we have a housing shortage. So you've seen we have multiple families living in one household. And so we do get relief from FEMA. So often we'll have FEMA trailers, but we're finding a lot of lead associated with these homes. So the state's been having these homes called they call them the governor's home. So we've been able to find other ways to kind of address this housing insecurity. But you know, all that stuff influences these learning disabilities and these ADHD characteristics. Fetal alcohol syndrome, and then and that fetal alcohol syndrome really kind of like gets to me. So I be careful because it's my community, right? And so I always think like those are my relatives, and I grew up there, and my mom, everybody's still there. And so one year we went back one summer. We go back. I have really close ties to my community. So we go back, and there's this huge sign, right? And I'm a public health student, and we're learning about secondary, primary, and tertiary prevention. So I'm like, this is great. It's a big sign, right? That shows this mom in a womb, and it's a campaign to address this fetal alcohol syndrome, right? And I'm over here like, this is great. This is gonna really help people, and I was so excited, right? Took a picture. I was like, I can't wait to show my like public health colleagues. They're just gonna, and so I showed it, and then one of the few minority students in the program, she was like, they were making fun of you. And I was like, what? And she was like, really, she was more worked up, and I was like, oh, well. And so I wish I had a picture of it. I thought we took a picture. I don't know if you have a picture, Sean, of this time I'm talking about. But I can get a picture, and I can email it to Sean to show you. And that's kind of when I realized, I was like, oh, this isn't like normal. You know what I mean? And I went through this when I first started at KU. Growing up poor, I didn't realize I was poor until I got there, and I was like, oh my God, wait, you have your own car? Like what? You know? And so, yeah, and I almost quit school. You know, I was almost a statistic as well. And so anyways, back to the fetal alcohol syndrome side, and that's kind of when I really realized, like, and then being a mom and my kid, not, I've never been off a reservation, so my children are in an off-reservation school, and that's been really fascinating and kind of it helped me as a researcher and as a community advocate as well. But I was thinking, wow, like these type of things would never be allowed to be imaged around her classmates. Like, you know, so I often think about that. And then asthma, depression, anxiety, we have high rates of suicide. I think the youngest person to commit suicide in our community was 11 years old, and she hung herself on a playground. Obesity and diabetes. And these are just the health components. These aren't like the social determinants of health, like things like housing issues, the foster care system, like any of those. This is my community, Whitehorse. And you can see they don't have infrastructures to play. We have high rates of obesity, but they don't have the equipment to kind of get that daily activity that's recommended. And these are actually ours. We went down and we did Kate, Aria, and Case. We went in, we're doing community outreach. We're doing, we have a primary traveling screening clinic where we kind of give them their readings, and then if they need to be connected to a primary care doc, we do that. And so we always have something set up for kids when we go. And then this is at one of our other events, and this is at our community. We had like a CRF powwow. It was a kids powwow. We went to do something for the youth because they have nothing to do. And so they're really excited. When we come, they like chase it down. They're like, hey, like, you know, we remember you from last year. So it's really cool to see the impact like that we get through outreach that we have on our community. So American Indian infant health. So American Indians are 2.5 times more likely to die before their first birthday than a non-Hispanic white infant. And when these infants are passing away in our communities, they're passing away at 30 days, 30 to like 90-day period. So it's not that immediate the way it would be measured in a non-Hispanic white population, and that's where they count that mortality rate. American Indians are the only ethnic racial group that have not had a decline in infant mortality between 2005 and 2014, and this is the most updated statistic. And I get these stats from Indian Health Service. American Indians are nearly 4 times as likely as a non-Hispanic white to have a mother who received prenatal care in the 3rd trimester, not at all. And prenatal care rates for American Indians who do not use Indian Health Service are unknown. And so this is kind of like my area of interest because we have high rates of developmental delays, disabilities that impact attaining college degrees, right? And so I'm like, well, if we can prevent it in utero when these babies are in the womb, and we can do that through prenatal care as a way to kind of help them reduce risky behavior. But if they were to, I'm looking at utilization of prenatal care in the 1st trimester, right? So if these mothers are coming in that 1st trimester, and the 1st trimester is where they do all like the screening for any type of Down syndrome, then would they then be able to give them that specialty care, because in Indian Health Service, they don't have access to specialty doctors. So you can see these huge gaps in services for this population that would prevent all the stuff that was on my child's health, the health status. So I'll just go through these really quick. Infant mortality is 9.4 per 1,000 live births compared to a non-Hispanic white of 4.9 per 1,000 live births. The leading cause of death for American Indians is birth defects, low birth weights, sudden infant death syndrome, and unintentional injuries. And these are all preventable. Birth defects can be addressed through folic acid, and there's a lack, and that would be attained through prenatal care. So you can see it's all really intertwined. There's a lack of prenatal care participation, and it's important because it reduces risky behaviors, as I mentioned. It gives health education, and it develops measures to determine developing measures for the fetus to make sure that they're growing properly. Recently, we've seen a lot of infants dying in the 2nd trimester because they're 12 pounds. So that fetal measuring is very important. And then the fetal screening. And so Indian Health Service serves 2.2 million American Indians, and they face extreme budget cuts, and they're very underfunded. We function on a global budget. So there's this saying in Indian country that says, don't get sick after June because they run out of money, right? And I experienced this. I had my firstborn in July, and it was very eventful. And the expenditures that are spent on a person, so the amount that's spent per person in the US is about $10,000 compared to on a reservation is around $4,000 that IHS will spend on an individual. So with the ACA, it's kind of, it has a lot of cracks for American Indian population, because the point of the ACA was to insure the uninsured, right? But there's a loophole that if you are a federally recognized Native American and you can receive service through Indian Health Service, you can opt out of this program. And so I'm kind of doing a lot of research there, looking at kind of that issue and those policies around there. But if you see, American Indians have the highest rate, and these are non-elders, so this is looking at ages 0 to 64 of uninsured. And so out of any ethnic racial group, we're the highest uninsured. And so what happens, as I mentioned, it's a global budget. So let's say we have primary care doctors, we have a pediatrician, and then we do have, depending on your service unit and the need of the service unit, then you'll have like some specialty docs. But we do not have OBs, right? Crazy, right? Considering we have all those kiddos that have all like the disability, the neurological delays, but yet we don't have that doctor there who's addressing it during prenatal care. So for the sake of time, I'll go fast. So some current research that we are doing at the center is I developed a cross-sectional survey, and there's no data, right? They often call our population the asterisk nation. And it's often funny because I get into a lot of like headbutts with my advisors because they're economists. So they're like, show me the data. I'm like, what data? You know, there's no data. So we wanted to kind of really get an understanding. So we created this survey to get the baseline data to see kind of what this was looking like. So we wanted to look at the experiences of these moms and the health of the kids. And so that was done in the Midwest here in Kansas and then in the Great Plains area. And we found some really interesting data. I did a qualitative interview, so that kind of informed the qualitative project. I wanted to see what these gaps were in this barriers to prenatal care. And it was really fascinating to see how much these roles that I mentioned earlier in my presentation really is influencing these moms' utilization of this service. And different medical interventions like amniocentesis, really important, right? And so, but they don't know what it is, and they're scared because they're like, well, they're gonna stick that in me, and so I'm not ever gonna be able to have a baby, and therefore I'm not gonna fulfill my role as an Indian woman because of the sterilization of indigenous women. So they're just scared to really take these needed medical interventions that will kind of reduce these rates of disparity for their kids. I'm developing a multi-level regression model to understand birth outcomes, and that's in attainment to insurance. So just kind of looking at modeling insurance and how this impacts so if these kids are to have insurance, what are their rates is that gonna then close that gap in mortality for our population? And we have different measurements going on there. We have a really great smoking cessation. Dr. Daly actually developed a All Nations Breath of Life. It's the best practice for smoking cessation. It's actually one of the only ones to really work in our population to show success. So it's really interesting to see the moms who kind of get involved with wanting to quit. And that's kind of like a blurry line, right, for smoking for us, because we use tobacco as a way of gift giving, prayer, ceremony. I mean, you know, I remember when I was pregnant and I went into a sweat lodge and they passed me the pipe and I'm like, you know, and my mom like hit me like, no, what are you doing, you know? So it's really fascinating to see kind of like the traditional use versus the contemporary use and kind of how that plays out in terms of like low birth weight. And Educational grants, we recently will have a cohort coming actually to Kansas City. We have 20 community members from all over the United States who work in the reservation communities, and some students who will be traveling to KU Med for a in-session grant writing program. So we have an online 12-month program, and then 2 of those months they'll come to Kansas City to kind of get that in-person grant writing experience from our center. And then health service research, so just really understanding kind of Medicaid, Medicare, and CHIP, and how that is deviated. We have my mom's the director of the Title I program, so I actually work closely with my colleague Josh, who was here, and then Dr. Daly's. We give service screenings to our kiddos on my reservation, and often when they need a speech therapist, nobody's there to pay for. So it's really fascinating to kind of understand those policies and ways that we can improve them. And some challenges, of course. Lack of data, limited data, lack of cultural understanding, and I mentioned that before, like that's really hard. And it's very important, right? Understanding these roles and kind of their identity and how, you know, health is viewed. Health is very different than in the non-native culture. And then extreme disparities and lack of services for the community. So, Wopila, and thank you, and I can answer any questions.
You guys got any questions for Jordyn?
I have a question about, on that last slide, it says lack of support from higher education.
Mm-hmm.
Could you tell?
Yeah, so like, I may have worded it wrong often. So I think that in order to really address our health disparities is we need to have people from those communities kind of getting the education and kind of attaining the resources. Then, for example, my sister, she's my cousin, but my grandma raised us, right? Same story. So we were raised as sisters, but she wants to be a physician, and me and Sean were actually just talking about this on the way down. And I'm like, no, get a PhD, we need researchers, you know, you could serve more people. But he's like, no, leave her alone, she wants to be a doctor. So, but like, you know, she can go back and she can serve our people, right? I think of my grandma who was on dialysis for many years, and how rude the doctors were to her. And she just didn't want to go. And we were like, Grandma, you gotta go. Like, you know, and I had a daughter who was named after her. She named her. And so she, you know, that's kind of what would motivate her, you know what I mean? Your grandkids, you know, you're an Unchi, we want you to know them. And so she didn't want to go because of the doctor didn't understand. And so when she would do dialysis, when it was a native nurse there, they would let my daughter run back there, right? Dialysis is a really rough procedure. But she knew that tie to that kid, what that kid does to this woman, it would keep her going, right? And so I think that, with that being said, I think that's how we can start to address some of these problems, is kind of bring people back to our communities. But it's hard for us to leave, you know, it's hard for me. Often, personally, I have to talk to Sean. I mean, I just grew up on a reservation, so my daughter's in school here. There's stuff about like race. I'm like, how do I address race? Or I'll drop her off, be like, oh, by the way, can you talk to her about this, you know? Because I don't know. I mean, I didn't have to deal with this stuff. I don't know, you know, and I think, and I often feel bad because me as an adult going in a freshman in college, I couldn't do it. You know what I mean? I didn't know the answers. And I think like in undergrad one year, my professor was gonna fail me, and he said, well, you're lying, and I need death certificates. And so I was like, well, you know, like life expectancy is, you know, 60 years, 70 years old. And I have a big family, I mean, you know, and people die a lot. So he thought I was lying about that. But like, to be at a burial ceremony is very important to a Native person. And so like those type of things, because he didn't have that cultural understanding, it made it hard for me. I wasn't trying to get out of school. You know, I really want to get a degree. That's why I'm here. But just because of that, things like that really make it hard for us. So I really appreciate you guys taking here and, you know, wanting to learn, because it will make a difference for your students. And when I say that, that's what I mean. And often, sometimes I have to go to Dr. Daly's house when I'm doing work for my doctor and be like, how do I explain this? Or, you know what I mean? Because, I mean, I have my firsthand experience, but he has an understanding, an outside perspective to help me kind of break it down for a way that they can understand. And that's challenging when that's your only way of life. And I'm like, well, you know, so I think that it's harder for us. Dr. Daly did his sabbatical in my community, and we got to do like these really fun interviews with these kids. And so I forget what it was. I just remember the results because I was like, oh my God, like, yeah, they're right. Because I was just kind of guessing. I was like, I bet you these are going to be, we were kind of guessing what the answers were good, what their responses were going to be. And they were spot on. These kids weren't wanting to go to college because their grandma said not to. Well, that ties back to boarding school. They don't want us to go to school because, you know, we're going to lose our identity, we're going to lose our culture, we're going to lose our way of life, especially for women, because we're the ones to pass it on. We should be having babies. It's a joke in my family. They're like, oh, you don't have enough kids. But it's funny when I walk out of daycare, they're like, oh my God, you have a lot of kids, you know? So just getting those mixed emotions is hard, you know? How do I live in both lives? And that's often what a student, a Native student has to do when they're getting higher education is, how do you walk in both worlds? I hope I answered it.
You touched on what I was going to ask you, which is how you're perceived by your community now when you go back. Do they feel that you've like abandoned them because you moved away, or are they happy for your success?
No, I think at first it was really rough. I think I don't when I go, my mom always tells me, she's like, I don't care. One time I lipped off and we had a physician from KU Med come, and she kind of like swatted me with a wood spoon, and I'm gonna die. I think I had a child at this time. His eyes were big. He's like, are you okay? And I was like, yeah. He's like, so he had texted Dr. Daly, Chris, and was like, I think her mom just spanked her. But, you know, and she said in front of him, she said, I don't care. Just because you have a degree, you're not better than anybody. And so, you know, I think I've learned, like when we go in, we don't, you know, I don't talk about my degrees. I talk about like, I grew up there. You know, a lot of those people raised me, and so, but I make sure that, you know, we bring back services, and we're in our community a lot. Like Dr. Daly's are like part of our community now because we're up there so much. You know what I mean? So, yeah. No. Mm-mm. I think it's hard. It's hard though for me to leave because I can't relate to people. You know, and when I went to KU, it was really rough for me because just the values are so different. You know, we don't value like handbags or cars. We value like kids, you know, and like as a young woman, I should be having a family and married and kids. And so that's what I thought, you know, coming in, I was like, oh, nobody has kids. And so if you ever notice too, a lot of us, we all have kids, and our kids come with us everywhere. They do everything. So I don't know. It's kind of, I think it's an individual's kind of experience, but not for me. I have close ties to my community though.
Because the age of maturity is considered when menstruation starts, and childbearing is so closely tied to women's value and identity in the community, is there any kind of stigma against childbearing outside of marriage or anything like that, or is it okay?
Yeah, because I mean, you know, we're married through a pipe, so that ceremony is very different than in a church and the values behind it. You know, when my mom explained it to me, when my parents got married, my parents are very traditional. You know, they live on the red road. And so that means like my dad's a pipe carrier, so he don't drink, he don't do any of that. So when they got married, the medicine man told him, when she puts your shoes outside the door, you leave and you don't come back. And she keeps everything because that's her home, and that reflects kind of those roles I was talking about. The women, they kept the teepee, and that was their duty. And so that's kind of the role, and it's still played out. It's just they have ceremonies, but it's those values are still kind of followed in this modern way.
Are marriages registered in any way?
Yeah, so a lot of people are married and then they don't. I mean, it just depends on the family, the preference. So if you get married through a pipe, like a ceremony, that's recognized through the tribe. But you can get a tribal marriage license, and then you can get like a county or a state one as well. So you have all options. I mean, it's your preference. And then some people aren't as traditional. So, and a lot of our people went to boarding school, so a lot of our population are Catholics. So they will get married the Catholic way, and then they believe the Catholic way. Like my grandma, she went to boarding school. She was a strong Catholic, like never missed mass. We always had to get up and go. The first of the month we were always there. And so she believed that, when my grandfather left her, she never got married, but she still like did the traditional way. So, it's a preference thing, and that's kind of what makes it hard when we're kind of giving this maternal education, is because there's so many different beliefs within even the tribe. So you just have to be really like conscious and aware.
Is it really common for people to marry and have kids very young then?
Mm-hmm.
So like teenage?
Well, yeah, they'll mm-hmm. Because of like the dynamics of the traditional marriage, they'll usually sometimes they would get married in a sweat lodge, so it just depends on that family's belief. But so I mean, we have high rates of teen pregnancy, but that's kind of like that gray line with smoking, right? That's the same thing. If this is your role as a woman to have a lot of kids, but you're a teenager and by the time you graduate high school, you've already had 3 kids. I mean, how are you going to get a job? And then the unemployment and the economic opportunity is just so non-existent. I mean, it makes it challenging.
I was just thinking about how I think there's an MTV show, Teen Moms,
Mm-hmm.
something like that, where they kind of like make a spectacle of it.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and it's not like that. And like you said, like even when we're having kids young, it's a very sacred moment for us. So like the parents, the family is really involved, and then we tend to all live together as well, because those grandmas have such a vital role in your child's bringing. Actually, it's hard for my mom because she kind of expects to have my kids, and I'm like, no. So that's kind of been rough for her. I think for her identity, So she's always asking to have one of my kids, and then like last week she was like, "Are you pregnant by chance?" I was like, "No, I'm done." So yeah, I mean, it's an important thing for the unchis. That's what translates to grandma, and that's what she's called in the community now. Unchi, they call her unchi. She like loves it, and she's not that old, but she wants to be called unchi. So that's her identity.
You said she wants to have your kids. You mean just to visit for a few days?
No, she wants to raise them. Like she wants to take them from me and raise them. Yeah, and it's because of that. It's that cycle, right? It's what they did, and so that's what my grandma did to her. So now she wants to do that for me, and so but then she's an educator. She's just like, George is really getting access to this really good education, and so like the educated part of her, but then the indigenous part of her, the native part of her is like, that's my duty, So I think she's very conflicted sometimes.
So you mentioned that you go back home, and when you do, sometimes you bring services with you. I was wondering, because I coordinate community service things here, so I was wondering, are there other services that are brought into the reservation, and how are those viewed, and are there any that are successful?
Yeah, so typically you kind of get in through like a community member, and then like now, I mean, Dr. Daly and both Dr. Daly's, I mean, they're part of our community. I mean, often I'm not even the middleman, where they just go straight to them. So I mean, because they become a part of, and then my family is like hunka'd them, like adopted them. So because of that, the way that extended is like once you're part of the family, you're part of it. It doesn't matter, and you're acknowledged throughout the tribe that you're a member of this community. But it's hard to get in because of the mistrust. They call it helicopter researchers, and that happens a lot. We have people that will come in and do screenings, and then, hey, your kid has autism, bye, you know? Like I mentioned, that kiddo had spina bifida, had to go, the only where he can get service is Denver. And this is a really poor population. So it's often hard, you know, it's hard to, and then you got to get approved through our tribe. We have, like, if you want to do research, we have a tribal IRB board. Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, it took us years. I mean, and I'm from that community, and even when I'm up there, it's like I'm kind of like I'm walking on my toes, you know. I mean, I think Sean can probably answer some. I don't know. Do you think I answered that correctly?
Yeah, Tyler's weighs in, but because you're dealing with so many layers of politics, federal, state sometimes, school, and then tribal, it's not as simple as like calling harvesters and saying, hey, I got people, can we get in? If you want to do stuff up there, you're going to have to go up once or twice on your own. They're going to have to meet you. You're going to have to visit with people. And like George said, a lot of it has to do with years and years of mistrust. They're very wary about who they let in. There's a joke up there on, not just there, a lot of the South Dakota reservations, you know, it's summer, when you see all the white vans up there, and it's mostly church groups and people wanting to do good, because they just get these influx of people, and that's what's not appreciated up there. They're looking for people to have these long-term committed investments, and you don't always get that. You get a church group up there once a week, they might come up for a summer or two, and then you never hear from them again. So they want to see that there's going to be some kind of long-term relationship, and they understand you're a school, you're going to bring students up, blah, blah, blah. But it's a reciprocal thing. And they don't want people coming up there to save Indians or have this feeling of, look at these poor Indians. They want this reciprocal working relationship. So yeah, it's very doable, but again, it's not like working around here where you sign an MOA or MOU and you're on your way.
Right.
There's a little bit of a vetting process before you're kind of said, yeah, why don't you come up and give this a go.
Well, I don't mean to imply equivalency, but I think that even around here, they get, like, you know, food kitchens. They get, everybody, their dog wants to serve on Thanksgiving or Christmas, but, you know, 363 days of the year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they don't want people running up there for a weekend to feel good in the summer.
Yeah.
You know, honestly, it's hard to get up there sometimes in December and January, not gonna lie. But there's also March, spring break. You know, there's fall breaks at certain schools. There's ways to engage throughout the year, and that's something that they're gonna look for.
And I think too, like Sean's sabbatical, for example, I mean, I think he was kind of like asked to do that. You know what I mean? And I felt really bad because it was our school administrators being like, hey, can he help us like do this? And so, and often in my family, they're very close ties, you know, and even I get really like under a microscope and you know, drilled. So you know, it's kind of like a situational thing. But I mean, it's really nice though, because we have these I think relationships are really important, because like when Sandy Rock was happening, my uncle's the chairman, and so he was kind of the spokesperson for a lot of, like, he knows like a lot of policy. He was the one talking to the UN, and so he wanted to make sure it was appropriately documented it. And so he had asked my dad to ask Sean, and so then I was like, well, we have a colleague who's getting his master's at the time, and I was like, well, why don't you go do some stuff, you know? So I think that, I mean, and it's important too. I think it helps our people as well, because a lot of people don't really know like how harsh life is, and I think it's eye-opening. So like when we get students, like I almost quit school. My advisor told me, she said, you should go to JCC, there's this class, just take this class. She's like, I'll pay for it out of pocket. Like, I don't want you to quit school, just take this class. And so I did, and I was Native American, right? Yeah. And I don't think Sean liked me at first because I was kind of rude to him, like, what, I'm gonna be taught my culture, you know, by a white man? But, you know, and now we have like this really great relationship, and my communities really benefit from it, so, yeah.
But we were talking before when we were walking over here, she has professors at KU who give her crap all the time. She'll give statistics like this and they'll be like, that's not real. They're like, it can't be that bad. It's like, no, it's that bad. And there's like, no one has 88% unemployment rate. And it's like, actually, yeah, they do. No one's that poor. Yeah, they are.
A big one, I study the health system, right, with economists. And it's funny, they're like, well, the government would never let anybody do that. Like, never. And then I was telling them about when I had my daughter. Actually, we were up there when I went into labor. We were doing community outreach. I think I was a Susan G. Komen scholar. We were having a walk with
Yeah,
Georgia.
you were.
Yeah, and then we put on this walk because I was a Komen scholar and we had to do so many activities. So we were all up there. His wife kept telling me that she's like, you're gonna go into labor. They're like, you need to sit down. And I was trying to make it back home with them, like catch the JCC van, because I knew that my daughter was about to be born into this really crappy health system. And I didn't want that. And unfortunately she was, and I held her in my birthing canal for 30 minutes. And so finally my grandma was like, well, step over, and then they were mad because we had so many women in there, but that's a cultural thing. And so my grandma said, well, you're gonna have to beat me out of here. And she, Lakota women we're warriors, right? We're bred to be warriors and tough, so they're feisty. But she was ready to go rounds with that nurse and that doctor, and I held that baby. So she said, well, let's get this show on the road. And and I was high risk. I mean, it was really dangerous. And so I often share that when we're making these models and trying to measure quality and safety. I said, well, for these people, it's not a quality thing, it's safety, because it's not a luxury. Healthcare is not a luxury to them. It's last minute, So it's been interesting. I've been over at their house a few times, almost in tears or frustrated, and yeah.
All right, guys. That'll be it for today. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you guys.